University of Kutztown here in Pennsylvania in the US. So good morning to you if you're in this time zone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on what time zone you're at. And I'm originally from Germany. I've lived in the US for about 12 years now, earned my second master's degree from Central Michigan University in communication studies, and then my PhD in communication studies from Texas A&M University. Here at Kutztown University, I research and teach in the areas of international media, political communication, and crisis communication. And if you're interested in my research or my teaching, feel free to use your smartphone and capture this QR code that will take you to my website. Now, for today's presentation, I'm really running you through this agenda here. I'll briefly discuss the problem and the rationale of my study that deals with Russian disinformation narratives about Ukraine, and then I'll get a little bit into the theory and research questions so that you see how I built my code system within MAXQDA. So then we'll get into the data collection aspect of it and the analysis. And then finally, while I will focus primarily on how I used MAXQDA tools in line with my approach for analyzing strategic narratives, I will also share with you a couple of the key implications and findings of my study, and then I'm looking forward to the Q&A session in the end. All right, so let's get into it. This presentation is based upon a recent publication in the Journal for Communication Studies, Understanding Russia's Disinformation Narratives About Ukraine, a ratio-oriented approach to strategic crisis narratives. With this case study, I'm extending what Alistair Miskimmon, that's one of the theorists that I'm drawing up on, is referring to as strategic narratives. I'm adding to this theoretical approach, as you will see, and MAXQDA was really instrumental in combining the more deductive codes from the theory, in addition to a couple of the inductive codes that I developed in order to develop this ratio-oriented approach, or contribute to that, if you will. All right. So let's start with the problem. I'm in the discipline of communication studies, so I view the world of media through the lens of communication. And so one of the problems that I see from the perspective of international communication and media is that we are starting to live in a world that's highly fragmented. And so you probably recognize in this image here a couple of the traditional and older international news outlets like Voice of America, that has been around since the Cold War, Radio Free Europe, or CNN International, which really became very popular in the 90s. And then in Germany, of course, DW, Deutsche Welle. But then you see also new kids on the block, if you will, right? You see Al Arabiya in Saudi Arabia, Al Jazeera in Qatar, Press TV in Iran, CGTN in China, and RT and Sputnik in Russia, Telesur in Venezuela. So all of a sudden, we are confronted with conflicting narratives and a variety of Western and non-Western narratives. And so the problem that I see from a communication perspective is that how in this fragmented media environment that we live in, and add to this also social media, which further fragments the media environment, the communication problem that I see is that all of a sudden some of the traditional narratives that we're so used to from the West that try to counteract Russian propaganda, for example, they cease to they no longer carry the communication power that they used to carry. So how do then Western narratives legitimize, specifically during crisis moments, right? Like the Ukraine war, how do they then resist disinformation within this fragmented media system? In other words, how do you cut through the noise, right, in this fragmented media environment? So this is the problem that I'm starting with. And then the rationale is really that I'm turning to Russian disinformation narratives about Ukraine and how they are reported on by an organization called EU versus Disinfo, and we'll get to that in a moment. But of course, my contribution is not new. There's a lot of research out there regarding Russian disinformation. Here I'm listing just a couple of studies that deal with these situations when there's a political or economic crisis in Europe. that Russian disinformation tries to exploit those moments, right? Those are moments when European democracies are weak in terms of their communication, and then it's an easier target for Russian disinformation. So here you see Euromaidan protests as a crisis, Brexit referendum, EU elections, more broadly speaking, Catalonia, unofficial independent referendum, the Yellow Vest movement in France, and then of course COVID-19 pandemic. All of those studies are dealing with how Russian disinformation narratives, how they're targeting those moments of, if you will, democratic weakness, those moments of political crisis. So as I alluded to a moment ago, the rationale then for this study that ties to the problem is that the existing narratives that we're so familiar with during the Cold War into the 90s and also in the early 21st century are these narratives of peace and prosperity, of shared values, rule-based international order. But they problematize European countries' efforts really to communicate specific motivations for new foreign policies toward Russia. And as a German, of course, I also consume a lot of German media. So a few of you might remember that Germany's initial response to the Ukraine war was to send 5,000 helmets. Ever since then, we've seen really a 180-degree turn in Germany's foreign policy toward Russia and Ukraine, and you have a new narrative, more of a hard power narrative, if you will, toward Ukraine. So that is quite a shift. And so I'm saying, what are now the actors? Right? What is the media that allows European countries to develop a new narrative and communicate new motivations and reasons for a new foreign policy? Because the war in Ukraine really changed the economic relationships and geopolitical relationships with Russia. Okay, so then I mentioned before that this case study turns to an organization called EU versus Disinfo. Now, there are a variety of anti-fake news or anti-disinformation organizations out there. Just to mention a few, Stop Fake News, Ukraine Crisis Media Center, or the Digital Forensic Research Lab. All of those are high-quality organizations that are counteracting disinformation narratives. And EU versus Disinfo predominantly focuses on Russian disinformation narratives. So then the question is, okay, how do I, and this is another theoretical layer of my project, is I'm considering EU versus Disinfo as, if you will, a little bit of a strategic crisis narrator. Right? There's a specific crisis, and whenever there's a political economic crisis, there is a communication vacuum that opens up, and then different stakeholders, they step into it and try to narrate the crisis in their favor, in their interest. And so I'm arguing that EU versus Disinfo, by debunking Russian disinformation narratives, they create their own narratives and step into this vacuum to start to control a little bit of the narrative in this crisis. And there's some research that supports me in this theoretical perspective, that people argue that there's training and expertise in those organizations that are built around nation branding, public diplomacy, soft power, and journalism. And so when they right the wrongs of falsification from Russian media, they in a way also engage in soft power and public diplomacy in a way, and nation branding. And probably the quote that really very strongly articulates this position is the one from that you see down here at the bottom. The verification of news in this way becomes also a form of ideologic voluntary assistance, contributing toward the political goals of government and other actors. And considering that EU versus Disinfo was initiated by the EU, this is, if you will, a semi-extension of EU interests. And so with that, I think that's a nice transition into getting a little bit into what EU versus Disinfo, what this organization actually is. It was initiated in 2015. 28 European countries decided on a mandate for the East Strategic Communication Task Force of the European Action Service. And their goal is to increase public awareness and understanding of the Kremlin's disinformation operations, and to help citizens in Europe and beyond to develop resistance to digital information and media manipulation. What's interesting about this, and here you see a couple of the specific goals also listed, but what's really interesting and what adds to the idea that EU versus disinfo really functions also as a strategic crisis narrator in the Ukraine war is that they have quite a bit of reach, right? It's not only that you can subscribe to their newsletter, they have their reports, they have a database where they collect a lot of Russian disinformation, but they brief and train EU institutions, member states, governments, journalists, and civil society organizations. And so here you see the reason why I chose this organization is also because they have quite a bit of reach. It's not only the reporting and the other features on their website, but they act as a crisis narrator beyond that. Okay, a little bit about what type of texts are we actually dealing with. So I'll get to the data collection in a moment, but I pulled 84 articles from the feature called Disinfo Targeting Ukraine by EU versus Disinfo. But just to give you a sense of what some of these reports, how they work. A lot of it is that they use strategies like the old hat strategies, right? We've seen this before by Russia's disinformation in Russia's disinformation narratives, so that you kind of minimize the effect of these strategies by saying this is old. We've seen this before. We are aware of the intent here. You also see hyperlinks to disinformation's database. That's a very powerful strategy that they use because they can say, okay, we've seen this before in this instance, in this instance, in this instance. So the database is really that they're collecting continuously, they're collecting Russia's disinformation, and they refer to that in their articles and as well in their reporting. Another strategy is that they diversify and surround information or surround disinformation with diversified information from journalistic sources, academic sources, other anti-fake news organizations, a couple of which I mentioned a moment ago, like Stop Fake and the Digital Forensic Research Lab, but also think tanks like the International Crisis Group, Chatham House, or the Council of Foreign Relations. But they also then surround Russian disinformation with information from NATO, UN, EU, and OSCE. So, and then finally, they also sometimes expose Russian disinformation strategies specifically. So those are just a couple of the strategies that you would encounter in a typical report. To give you a little bit of an idea what kind of reports I was dealing with. They had a very, if you will, journalistic style to it. They were very concise and dense, and I basically used analysis. The unit of analysis was basically at the level of the paragraphs, because there was often a new thought unit that was introduced at the next paragraph. There were some exceptions where then a thought unit like ran into the next paragraph, which I then coded accordingly. But this here gives you a little bit of an idea of what their style is like. Okay, now let's get to my theoretical framework. I'm grounding my approach in Alistair Miskimmons. He's a professor at the University of London. He specialized in strategic narratives, and he defines strategic narratives as a means for international actors to construct a shared meaning of the past, the present, and the future of international politics and culture to shape behavior and domestic and international audience. He breaks down strategic narratives into a system level narrative, identity level narrative, and policy level narrative. System level is all about how a country views the world order. Right? What is Germany's, China's, the US's, or Russia's view of the world? Right? So that's a system narrative. And then identity narrative is how does the country view itself? How does it create a national identity through its narratives? And then finally, policy and issue narratives deal with if there are specific policies toward, let's say, Russia's policies toward Ukraine, how are they legitimized? Right? How are these actions and these policies legitimized in the narrative? Now, Alistair Miskimmons' theoretical framework is a lot bigger than just those three elements. He developed a research agenda that focuses on formation projection and reception of narratives. Formation is, of course, what goes into the construction of a narrative. You would look at, for instance, how specific journalists are trained, what is the media training in the country or the media outlets. So that's more the formation. That's not what I focus on in this case study. I focus on the projection, which is the actual message itself, if you will, the actual reports. Reception then would look at how are these narratives then received by specific international audiences. Elsa Miskimmen's research, if you're interested in strategic narratives, there are great studies that really focus on the relationship between these three elements: formation, projection, and reception, so that you also can speak a little bit about the effects of these narratives, not only how they are constructed and relayed in the message. Okay, and then this is a little bit my addition to this theory. Strategic narratives are also, they're broken down not only in terms of system level, identity level, and policy level narratives, but you would identify specific elements in the narrative: the agent, the act, the agency, the scene, the purpose. Those terms correspond with very typical journalistic questions like who, what, how, where, and why. And here are just a couple of examples from the system level narrative from my analysis. Agents that you encountered at the system level narrative were NATO, EU, US, the West, Russia. As you can see, those are all world order actors or agents. Acts are, provoke, discredit, justify, violate. A lot of verbs go into coding acts. So you can think about how, for instance, Russia's disinformation narratives create this idea that the EU or NATO, the West, more broadly speaking, they provoked this war, right? So there is some relationship between the agent and the act. And so what I then add to this is here what Birdsall really argues as the persuasive power of these strategic narratives. The strategic narratives are based upon Kenneth Burke's pentat, and if you're interested in that, I'll be happy to answer any question about the theoretical approach later. But the idea is that it's the combination of these elements. It's not only the absence or presence of agent, act, agency, scene, and purpose in the narratives, but it's the combination. So as I already mentioned, for instance, Russia's disinformation narratives identifying, narrating the NATO, the EU, US, the West as provoking, right? Provoking this incident. So then Russia had legitimized, if you will, their invasion of Ukraine. Or you can think about how also Russian disinformation narratives speak about Ukraine belonging to Russia's sphere of influence, or even more broadly speaking, historically belongs to Ukraine, and so that is a reason for then Russia to act. So there you had you would have a combination between scene and act. The scene, as it is narrated by Russia's disinformation narrative, justifies the act or drives the act. So that is my contribution. That it's also about the relationships between these elements of the narratives. Okay, good. This is just, I just mentioned Kenneth Burke for a moment. Here's just a quote that I think is very intuitive at this point, where you deal with conflicting narratives, right? You have Russian disinformation narratives, and then you have, for instance, the EU versus disinfo trying to debunk those narratives and creating their own narratives. And so thereby you have a lot of clashing narratives. But it's, for this study, it's not only about the clashing narratives, it's also about what drives those narratives. What are the motivations that are communicated in those narratives? So that's the ratio-oriented approach to strategic crisis narratives. I know it's a mouthful, but it really focuses on specific elements in the narratives and how they relate. Okay, so here are my 3 research questions for this project. First one is, what narrative elements drive Russian narratives, Russian disinformation narratives at the level of policy, identity, and system narratives? So we just learned that there are these elements that relate in narratives. That's the first research question. The second one is that I focus on specific crisis phases, if you will. There was a military build-up before the invasion. There was the actual invasion of Ukraine. Then we had the southeastern shift, where the Russian military moved toward the southeast of Ukraine, and then we had Ukraine's counteroffensive. So I also wanted to look at, are there any significant changes in the narratives across specific crisis phases? And then finally, what narrative ratios tend to co-occur with what topics? So are there specific topics for these dominant narrative ratios that co-occur? Okay, so let's get into how I use MAXQDA to answer some of these questions. In order to collect my data, again, I mentioned 84 articles. I excluded a couple of articles because there were interviews, for example, but the 84 articles from the feature called Disinfo Targeting Ukraine, ranging from April 8th, 2001 to September 29th, 2022. I used a MAXQDA's web collector. I find this very useful for any type of text from the web. I used the simplify the web page function, and then I organized the publications according to date and broad geopolitical development. And I followed qualitative content analysis guided by Kenneth Burke's dramatic pentet, and which informs Alistair Miskimmen's ideas about strategic narratives. It was also great just to point out, those of you that haven't used the web collector function that works really nicely with the Chrome browser as an add-on. Whenever you import it, you also get the link to the original article, which can be very useful. And so you see that here in some of those screenshots. Okay. And then what I did for this project, and I usually do that for most of my projects, is that I want some sort of flexibility in terms of how I group my data. So going into this project, I knew that I wanted to look at trends, developments in the narrative. And so I looked at a lot of literature in terms of the specific crisis phases, like the military buildup, the actual invasion, the southeastern shift, and then also the counteroffensive. So then I attached those variables to the documents so that I could easily in MAXQDA just right-click on documents and then activate documents by variable. And so that allows me to quickly organize my data. That was very useful. But what I also did, because I wanted to visualize some of the trends, but also here in terms of data collection, just maybe a visualization of the data across the crisis phases, but also across months. So what's great about MAXQDA that it allows you for a lot of flexibility exporting your data into Word or Excel. So what I did here is that I just exported from the variable statistics. So under variable statistics, I exported it to Excel, and then you see that down here. And then I just created a basic pivot chart. In Excel, you just click on Insert, Insert Pivot Chart. And then here I had these three elements: dates, geopolitical development, and frequency. And that allowed me to then nicely plot out my data that you can see here. And so this is just the collection of the data in terms of how many reports in this feature by EU versus Disinfo occurred per month, but also by geopolitical development, or if you will, a crisis phase. So that was really great. And for those of you that want to do this, I recommend going to the variable statistics and export that, and then create pivot charts in Excel. All right. Good. In terms of data analysis, I really, again, applied the more deductive codes from strategic narratives, as you see here in my code book. So we have system level narrative, identity level narrative, policy narrative. My first reading of all the data, as you see also in the code book, focus on Alistair Miskimmen's ideas of, okay, there are agents, their acts, their agencies, their scenes, and their purposes. But after two of the initial readings, then I also developed the ratios, right? For instance, scene-act ratios or act-act ratios, as you see here for the policy level narratives. So that allowed me to then start to see relationships between those elements and to see like, okay, is the scene driving the act? Is the agent driving the act? Is the purpose driving the act? And so that allowed me to get a little bit deeper. And that's when I really got into the data-driven codes, which were, of course, then more inductive. Okay, so to answer my first two research questions, I used predominantly the code matrix browser, but also what really helped was then also the crosstab to see a little bit more of the frequency across some of the variables. And then what's wonderful about the crosstab, but also the code, well, about the crosstab in particular, that you can then switch between a more qualitative view of your data and then more quantitative view of your data. So you have it side by side, can always check. Okay, and then in terms of then looking at some of the trends, the code matrix browser helped a lot because I organized my data in terms of months, but also in terms of geopolitical development, crisis phases, and the way I organized it, and I used the code matrix browser and had the second level of the documents, and that gave me the all of the levels in terms of the crisis phases, but then also the months. And then I did the same that I did with the data collection. I exported to Excel, created a pivot chart, and that allowed me to look at all of the codes, specifically the system level narrative, identity level narrative, and policy level narrative. And that then created this type of chart where my readers could easily see, okay, there are some, there are key developments and key differences across the different phases. And that, of course, speaks to my research questions in terms of how the trends develop. So I find this very useful. That's very powerful that you can, seamlessly export data and visualize it that way. Okay, and then turning to my third research question, what narrative ratios tend to co-occur with what topic? And so I knew that I, of course, wanted to use the code relation browser to see what are the relationships between specific topics or themes and the specific codes regarding my regarding the narratives, the different levels of narratives. But in order to automate a little bit of the thematic analysis, if you will, or the topic extraction, I built a dictionary, and I'm following the basic process of a reading. If you're interested in dictionary building, I really recommend by the 2019 article by Deng, Inside the Black Box of Dictionary Building for Text Analytics. And just for those of you that want to get into dictionary building, of course, you carefully select words and word combinations to build categories and to extract specific concepts. For me, it was very domain specific. Right? There are some dictionaries out there, like if you think about sentiment analysis, some of them are domain independent. They cut across different corpuses and different texts. But for me, it was clear, it was very, very specific to my domain. And first, you identify the purpose. For me, it was clear, this topic extraction. It was based upon the case study. It was limited data set because I just wanted to see some basic relationships between themes and topics. My goal was not to build and validate a dictionary for any type of anti-fake news narratives pumped out by EU versus Disinfo or Stop Fake or the Digital Research Lab. That was not my goal, so it was very much for this, just for this project. So then data cleaning was very important. So stop words and phrases, as you see here in some of the screenshots. I cleaned up my data at first. That I wanted to make sure, okay, let's create an exclusion list. In addition to the the basic list. I added more things to just clean it up, and then I built the categorizations that were data-driven. It was very useful for the data-driven process was the keyword and context. I decided that keywords have to be at least in 8 out of the 84 articles, and then I used also the constant comparative method to always check, do the words in my categories, and you see in the top screenshot one theme or one topic, illegal annexation of Crimea, and you see a couple of the phrases. I highly recommend, from my experience, that you really start with phrases, because phrases, as opposed to words, carry a lot more specific meaning. But they also added some words to it, and then always use the keyword in context function to see if I'm actually capturing the right themes, if this is actually what I'm looking for. And then for basic validation, also really the keyword in context function to just see, is this actually capturing what I want to capture? There's a lot more to dictionary building, but I followed the basic structure. And there's some shortcomings that are also addressed in this article by Deng. Possible double count. Now, MAXQDA helps you with that. Specifically, the function under MAXDictio that you can, count same word only once. Some limitation to this specific case study is that's a small data set, and domain expertise is necessary. All of my research mostly focuses on strategic narratives. This was the first project where I brought this approach into the realm of disinformation narratives. I consume EU versus disinfo through the newsletter quite a bit. I also teach this, but I wouldn't consider myself to be a domain expert. And so this might be, this also is considered a little bit of a shortcoming. Those of you interested in actually building a dictionary with validation, I recommend that you maybe bring in experts to validate the dictionary if you want to use it on different corpuses in the future. Okay, as I said, MAXDictio tools are instrumental to this. The dictionary, obviously, then the dictionary-based content analysis, where you can also check some boxes for, not count the same word twice and so on. Word frequency, I usually start with, word combinations and word frequency, and I have the dictionary window open, and I have the word combination window open, and I just drag the phrases and word combinations in there to the specific categories. At that point, this was the third research question of my project. I was already very immersed in the data. I was very comfortable with the data, and so that's why I then built this toward the end of my project. And then, as I mentioned, keywords and context. And I also use the interactive word tree, which is really nice because you can see how words and phrases, what text runs into them, what comes out of them, and you can set them to beginning, middle, and end. That's also very, very powerful, in my opinion. Okay, so this brings us to the conclusion, the final slide, just in broad brushstrokes. There's a lot of literature that's out there that suggests some of the key disinformation strategies by Russia and media is Russia's fire hose propaganda, that you just flood information spaces, right? That you just go into Eastern neighborhood, the Soviet Union's former satellite states, and you just blast it with this information. And my findings support this in a unique way, because what you see is that Russia strategically defines narrative ratios, agent, scene, act, that allows Russia to very, very quickly exchange motives. So as you remember, I really wanted to focus on what are the elements in the narrative that drive the narrative. So if Russia says something like we have to denazify Ukraine because there's a scene of Nazification happening, then it's the scene in Ukraine that then creates a narrative. It's the situation in Ukraine. They also used it with really amplified the idea of the narrative of like civil war in Ukraine, disarray in Ukraine, and so that creates a scene that then justifies an act. But what I noticed is that these elements were quickly exchanged. There was no consistency in them. So that speaks also to this fire hose propaganda argument, just at the level of motivations, where we can quickly create narratives that have the same structure, for instance, scene act, but the scene always changes, but the structure remains, right? So, and then in terms of more implications, I would say vis-a-vis Russian disinformation narrative, Russia's war in Ukraine allowed EU versus disinfo to create a context, a new space. Remember, we started this, I started this presentation by saying one of the communication problems is that there's a fragmented media environment, and EU versus disinfo is starting to create a new context to develop new directions and desirabilities for EU policies in the Eastern neighborhood. And what's also interesting, just in terms of implications, that there's a dominance of agent-act ratios, right? Russia presents itself as very dominant, competent, and act ratios, and they evoke a little bit of the impression of confrontation. Like if you imagine that there are narratives that would be more driven by the purpose, right? Why it is happening? You would have less of the typical confrontation at the level of, you know, you act, we act, right? Retaliation, that kind of thing, or that it's just a great power politics, right? It's about different great power agents that are clashing. So I found this also very interesting, and that could open up space for EU anti-disinformation narratives that possibly focus more on purpose-driven narratives. All right, that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.